The desert does not care about your reasons. That was the first thing Callum Gray thought when Ward Pewitt and his two men blocked the trail into Red Canyon Valley, their horses standing three abreast across the narrow pass, their shadows falling long and dark across the red earth. The sun was high and merciless. The canyon walls rose on either side, red sandstone baked to the color of old blood, offering shade with the same generosity as a closed fist. Callum had been riding since before dawn. He was 34 years old and looked it, and a few years more, besides not from sickness, but from the particular weathering that comes to men who have spent too long carrying something heavy without setting it down. His face was angular and sun-darkened, the kind of face that belongs outdoors and knows it. His eyes were pale gray, the color of creek water over flat stone, and they moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent years reading landscapes and had never quite stopped. Pwitt was a heavy-set man in his late 40s with a deputy's badge that caught the sun and threw it back with what Callum could only describe as unnecessary enthusiasm. He had the smile of a man who believed he already knew how every conversation would end, and the eyes of a man who had never been persuaded otherwise. Callum Gray Pewitt said, "The way a man says a name when he is using it as a tool." Callum stopped his horse. He said nothing. He had learned early that silence was often more efficient than response, and that men who needed to fill silence usually filled it with useful information. "My name is Ward Pewitt, deputy out of Seco Wells." He tilted his head slightly as though examining Callum from a different angle might reveal something the straight view had missed. "You are headed into the valley." "I am headed toward the river," Callum said. "I understand there is land available for purchase in that direction." Pewitt's smile stayed where it was fixed and purposeless. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, which he held out across the space between them. "We would like to make you an offer," he said. $50 for your time and your trouble. You ride back the way you came. There is other land in the territory. Good land, no complications." Callum looked at the paper. He did not take it. $50 was not nothing. $50 was 2 months of wages at the last ranch he had worked in New Mexico, where he had spent 14 months fixing fences and counting cattle and trying to figure out what exactly a man was supposed to do with a debt that was not made of money. $50 was the kind of number that deserved to be taken seriously. He looked at the paper for a long moment. He looked at Pewitt. He looked at the two men behind Pewitt who had the patient, unhurried quality of men who were being paid to be present and had no strong feelings about the outcome. Then he touched his heel to his horse's flank, clicked his tongue once, and rode around all three of them without saying another word. He heard Pewitt call after him. Something about a mistake. Something about the Apache. Something about there being only one way this ends. Callum did not turn around. The canyon walls rose on either side and the sound of Pewitt's voice bounced between them and faded, and then there was only the sound of his horse's hooves on the dry ground and the wind moving through the gaps in the rock above and the desert doing what the desert always did, which was continue regardless of whatever small human dramas were being conducted at its surface. He had been afraid of Pewitt before he saw him. He was still afraid now in the quiet, functional way that he had learned to treat fear as information rather than instruction. Men who paid other men to go away were usually doing something they did not want witnesses for. And the something they were protecting was almost always worth more than what they were offering to make the problem disappear. He had paid attention to that calculation on the trail from Tucson. He had paid attention to a great many things on that trail, which was 3 weeks and 200 miles of red rock and scrubland, and his own company, which was not the worst company he had kept, but was not the best either. He had paid attention most of all to the map. 2 hours after he left Pewitt behind, the canyon opened. Callum pulled his horse to a stop on the low rise where the trail crested before dropping into the valley, and he looked at what lay below him, and for a moment he forgot about the map and the debt and the 4 years of working other men's land in other men's states. He simply looked. Red Canyon Valley stretched out in the midday heat like something from a painting he had once seen in a government building in Washington, which was the only place he had ever been where paintings were hung in official buildings as though beauty were a matter of public record. Red walls on 3 sides, flat scrubland in the middle yellow-green, in the places where the soil held enough moisture to support something living. And in the distance, close to the western edge, where the land dropped gently toward the river, a collection of structures and tents that shimmered in the heat haze. He was afraid now in the same quiet way he had been afraid for the past 2 hours. But underneath the fear, there was something else, something that had been sitting in him for 4 years, like a stone in a boot, and the stone was this. He had come to this valley because he owed a debt he had not been able to figure out how to pay, and he was going to try to pay it anyway, and he had no idea yet what that was going to create him. He started down the slope. They saw him before he was halfway across the valley floor. Of course they did. He was a single man on a dark horse moving across open ground in the middle of the day. You would have to be asleep to miss him, and the people of this valley in his limited experience were not asleep. Two riders came out from the camp and positioned themselves in his path. Callum slowed to a walk and kept his hands visible and his posture easy because the worst thing you could do when someone was deciding whether you were a threat was to look like you were thinking about whether you were a threat. The rider on the left was young, maybe 26, with the watchful stillness that comes not from calmness, but from controlled readiness. He had a lean, angular face and dark eyes that moved over Callum the way a man reads a document looking for the part that matters. "You are on Apache land," the young man said. His English was clear and unaccented, which surprised Callum enough that he almost let it show. "I know," Callum said. "I am looking to speak with your chief. I have business to discuss." "Business?" The young man said the word as though tasting it and finding it neither good nor bad, which was itself a kind of answer. "Land," Callum said. "I am looking to purchase a pothole by the river if there is one available." The two riders exchanged a look that contained more than Callum could read. Then the young man on the left turned back to him. "Get down from your horse. Leave your rifle with the saddle. You can keep the sidearm." Callum got down. He pulled his Winchester from the scabbard and hung it from the saddle horn without being asked to do it slowly or carefully. He just did it the way you do something when you have nothing to hide about doing it. The young man watched this with an expression that was not quite approval, but was the thing that lives next door to it. "I am Nolan," the young man said. "The chief is my uncle." He said nothing else. He turned his horse and expected Callum to follow on foot, leading his own horse by the reins, and Callum followed on foot, leading his horse through the edge of the camp and into the open area near the center, where a fire burned low despite the heat of the day. Chief Aldous Thorne was somewhere in his late 50s. He was broad across the shoulders, though the bulk had thinned some with age, and he sat very straight the way a man sits when he has trained himself out of the habit of leaning. His hair was silver and pulled back from a face that was all planes and angles with the accumulated weight of a great many years of making decisions that affected other people. He did not stand when Callum approached. He did not extend a hand. He simply looked at Callum with the measured, unhurried attention of a man who had learned long ago that the fastest way to understand something was to observe it without interruption. Callum stopped at a respectful distance and waited. "Sit," Thorne said. Callum sat. The chief studied him for a long moment, the way a man looks at a piece of land before deciding what it might be good for. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply looking with the full weight of his attention. Then Thorne said Callum Gray. He said it the way a man says a name he has been sitting with for a long time. Not a question. Callum felt the hairs on his arms lift slightly beneath his shirt. Something moved through him that was not quite fear and not quite recognition. Something between the two. "Yes, sir," he said. Something passed across Thorne's face, brief and subtle, the expression of a man who has been waiting for something to happen and has just watched it happen. Not surprise, closer to confirmation. "You have come to buy land," Thorne said. "I have. I understand the parcel along the southern bend of the river might be available. I have $200. I know that is not what the land is worth in real terms, but it is what I have, and I would work it well. I am not looking to get rich. I am looking for a place to stay." Thorne looked at him. "Why here?" "There is other land in the territory." Callum had prepared an answer for this question. He had been preparing it for 4 years in various forms, testing it against different versions of this conversation in his head, and none of the versions had ever felt completely honest until this moment. He set the prepared answer aside. "I have reasons," he said. "Some of them I am not ready to explain yet, but I will tell you this. I rode past 3 men on the trail this morning who offered me $50 to turn around and go home." Thorne waited. "I did not take it," Callum said. Because men who pay other men to go away are usually protecting something, and the something they are protecting is almost always a plan that does not work if the wrong person shows up. Thorne considered this. The fire between them shifted in a small wind and sent a curl of smoke sideways. I have a daughter, the chief said. She is 22 years old. She is unmarried. He paused. The pause had a particular quality to it, the quality of a man who is about to say something he has thought about carefully and intends to say exactly as he has thought it. The land along the river will belong to the man who marries her and stays. That is the condition. It is the only condition. Callum said nothing for a moment. I would like to meet her, he said before I agree to anything. You may meet her. She will wear a veil when you do. She wears a veil always among strangers. This is not a custom I invented for your sake. It is how she has chosen to live, and I have chosen to respect it. You will not see her face until the day of the ceremony if you agree. That is part of the condition. Why the veil? Thorne's jaw tightened slightly. Because I have seen what men do when they see something they want. They stop thinking about anything other than having it. I need to know that the man who marries my daughter is not marrying an idea of her. I need to know he is marrying her. Callum looked at the fire. He thought about what was being asked of him, which was not a small thing. It was, in fact, an enormous thing, the kind of thing that a reasonable man would decline politely and ride away from without looking back. He understood that completely. He also understood the shape of a debt and the weight of one, and the way a debt does not go away simply because you are tired of carrying it. I will meet her first, he said finally. Tomorrow morning, Thorne said. If you agree after you have met her, the ceremony will be in 3 days. He said something, and Apache and Nolan, who had been standing at the edge of Callum's vision, stepped forward and gestured toward a smaller tent at the edge of the camp. Callum gathered his horse and followed. That night, after the camp had gone quiet and the fires had burned down to coals, Callum sat on the blanket inside the tent and opened his saddlebag. He was looking for the property deed template he had obtained from the land office in Tucson 3 weeks ago. He found it, and underneath it, pressed flat against the leather bottom of the bag, he found something else. A piece of paper. He had not put it there. He knew this with absolute certainty because he was the kind of man who knew exactly what was in his bag and exactly where it was. He unfolded it slowly. It was a survey map. He recognized the format immediately. The grid lines, the elevation markers, the small, careful notations in the margins. He had produced hundreds of documents exactly like this one during his 4 years working as a land surveyor and cartographer for the federal government's Bureau of Land Management out of Washington. This particular map showed a section of Arizona territory. The river bend was marked. The valley was marked. And in the lower right corner, where the certifying signature went, was his own name in his own handwriting. Callum Gray, Bureau of Land Management. Survey completed and certified March 1879. He sat very still for a long time. This was the map. Not a copy made from public records. Not a reproduction. This was an original document from the survey he had conducted 4 years ago. The survey that had classified this land as unoccupied federal territory available for commercial development. The survey that had set in motion a chain of legal proceedings that had very nearly resulted in the Apache people of this valley being removed from land they had lived on for 3 decades. He had not known the land was occupied when he began the survey. That was true. It was also in certain ways beside the point. What was not beside the point was this: when he had discovered the truth, when he had ridden into the valley and seen the camp and understood what he had done, he had refused to sign the final authorization. He had walked back into the bureau office in Tucson and told his supervisor that the survey was incomplete because the land classification was wrong. He had been told to sign anyway. He had refused again. He had been terminated 3 days later, and the authorization had been signed by someone else, and the legal proceedings had begun regardless, and Callum had spent the following 4 years working on cattle ranches in New Mexico and Colorado, thinking about what, if anything, a man could do about a wrong he had set in motion but not completed. He had thought coming here was the answer. He had not told anyone he was coming. He sat in the tent in the dark with his own handwriting in his lap and understood that someone had put this paper in his bag. Someone who knew who he was. Someone who knew why he had come. He refolded the map carefully. He placed it back in the bottom of the bag. He lay down on the blanket and stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent and listened to the desert night, which was full of small sounds if you knew how to hear them. He did not sleep for a long time. Dawn in the Arizona desert arrives the way certain truths arrive in a man's life, quietly without announcement, and then suddenly everywhere at once, in every direction at the same time. Callum was outside before the camp had properly woken, standing near the edge of the cleared area with a tin cup of water that one of the older women had handed him, without being asked, which he took as a sign that he had not yet done anything to make himself unwelcome. The morning air had the particular sharp clarity that belongs to desert places before the heat takes it a crispness that made the red walls of the canyon look freshly cut. He was thinking about the map. He had been thinking about it since he had found it, turning the problem over and examining each face of it the way you examine a piece of unfamiliar land. The map had not been in his bag in Tucson. He was certain of that, which meant it had been placed there on the trail at some point in the 3 weeks between Tucson and this valley by someone who had been watching him long enough to know his route and close enough to reach his gear without him knowing. The implications of all three of those things were uncomfortable in different ways and for different reasons. He was still turning this over when he became aware with a particular quiet alertness that had never fully left him since his years of outdoor work that he was not alone. There was a figure on the low flat rock 30 yards to his right. He did not look directly at first. He was standing with the cup in both hands, looking generally toward the canyon walls, and he simply let his attention shift sideways without moving his head, a habit so old he no longer noticed he was doing it. The figure was seated on the rock with their back to the valley facing the canyon wall. The white fabric covered everything from the crown of the head to the ground, and in the early morning light, it caught the pale gold of the just risen sun and held it in a way that was almost startling against the red of the rock and the brown of the earth. It was the most visible thing in the entire landscape, which struck Callum as something to think about. A person who wanted to be invisible did not sit on a rock in a white veil in the morning light where anyone could see them. He noticed a moment later the book. She was reading. He could see it clearly now. A small volume held in both hands at a slight angle, the pages pale against the white of her clothing. She held it with the particular practiced ease of someone who has been doing this specific thing in this specific way for a long time. Not performing, not showing off, simply reading the way you do something when it is as natural as breathing and you have stopped noticing that you are doing it. He did not know what language the book was in from this distance. He walked toward her. She heard him coming. He could tell by the slight change in her posture a subtle gathering of attention, like a person who has been alone and has heard a sound and is now deciding how to respond to it. But she did not put the book away. He noted that. He stopped at what seemed like a reasonable distance, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough away that she could stand and leave if she wanted to without having to step around him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The canyon was quiet in the layered way canyons are quiet in the morning, which is not actually quiet at all if you listen for the separate sounds that make up the whole. Wind in the rock above, the camp beginning to wake behind them. A bird somewhere doing something purposeful with a small piece of sound. "You are reading," Callum said. It was not a particularly impressive opening. He knew that. But it was true, which was something he had been trying to prioritize more often. "I am," she said. Her voice was low and clear with a quality of precision to it, as though she had learned English the way you learn a language when you have taught yourself from books, rather than from conversation attending to the exact sound and placement of each word. There was nothing uncertain about it. She spoke the way a person speaks when they know exactly what they are saying and have chosen to say it. "What are you reading?" he said. A pause, not hesitation. The pause of a person deciding how much of an answer to give. She turned the book so he could see the cover without turning to face him fully. He could read the title from where he stood. The Count of Monte Cristo. Callum looked at the book. He looked at the white figure holding it. He looked at the book again. "That is a long one," he said. "I have read it 3 times," she said. "I read it slowly the first time because I did not understand all of the words. The second time I understood the words, but not why he waited so long. The third time I understood why. Why did he wait?" She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense she was considering whether this conversation was one she wanted to continue. Because he was not ready yet, she said. Not because he lacked the strength, because he had not yet become the person who could use the strength correctly. Callum looked at the canyon wall. The light was changing on it, the early gold shifting toward the harder white of midday. He thought about a different kind of waiting, 4 years of it, and about the difference between waiting because you are not ready and waiting because you are afraid, and about how easy it is to confuse those two things when you are the one doing the waiting. That is a more precise reading than most people come to, he said. Most people have not read it 3 times. Something in the flatness of her delivery was almost funny, though he did not think she was trying to be. He had the sense that she said what she meant without the decorative layers that most conversations were padded with, and that this was not bluntness, but simply a preference for accuracy. I am Callum Gray, he said. I know who you are, she said. My father told me last night. What did he tell you? That a man had come, that he had agreed to the condition. She paused, and the pause had a particular quality to it, that his name was Callum Gray. He noticed she had not given him her name. He noticed also that she had not left, and that the book was now resting in her lap rather than held up at reading angle, which meant that whatever she had come to the rock to do this morning, she had stopped doing it in favor of this conversation. Did he tell you anything else about me? Callum said. The white veil shifted slightly. It might have been the wind. It might not have been. No, she said. And something in the timing of that single word, the way it arrived a fraction of a second later than a simple negative should arrive, told Callum that the answer was not entirely complete. But he did not press it. He had been in this camp for less than 18 hours. He had agreed to meet a woman whose face he had not seen. He was in no position to demand completeness from anyone. I have not been told your name, he said. Another pause. Longer this time. Desa, she said. He repeated it once quietly, not for her to hear, just settling it into the place in his memory where names went when they were going to stay. Desa. He said again, this time for her to hear, I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly because I think you are a person who prefers plain speaking. She did not respond to this, but she did not look away. I do not know what this arrangement is going to look like, he said. I do not know if it is going to work. I came here for reasons I have not fully explained to your father yet, and I will not pretend I am not a complicated person with a complicated history, because you would figure that out eventually, and it would be worse if I had pretended otherwise. He stopped and found the right words for the next part. But I am not here to take something and leave. I have done enough taking in my life without meaning to. I am not looking to add to it. The wind moved through the rock above them. The canyon was full of its small sounds. Somewhere behind them, the camp was finishing its waking up, and the smell of wood smoke and something cooking was beginning to find its way across the clearing. Desa was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into the folds of her clothing and produced something small which she held out toward him without rising from the rock. He stepped closer and took it from her hand, careful not to let his fingers touch hers, and looked down at what she had given him. A folded piece of paper worn soft at the creases from being opened and closed many times. He unfolded it. Inside was a single line of handwritten text in careful English letters, with the slight over-precision of someone who has learned to form letters from studying printed text rather than from watching someone else's hand. Wait and hope. He looked up at her. That is from the book, she said. I know, he said. I wrote it out when I first read it. I was 15. She paused. I kept it because it was the first sentence in English I understood all the way through. Not just the words, the meaning. Callum looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at the creases worn soft from years of opening and closing. He looked at the handwriting, careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a 15-year-old who was teaching herself a language from books and was determined to get each letter exactly right. He refolded it along its original creases and held it back out to her. She took it. This time their fingers did touch briefly at the edge of the paper. Neither of them acknowledged it, but neither of them moved away quickly either. Go on and finish your reading, he said. I will not keep you. He walked back toward the camp. He did not look back, though he was aware with the particular clarity of a man paying close attention that she watched him the whole way. That afternoon, Callum met Reed and Owen at the southern edge of the camp, where the trail from Seco Wells came in, and where his two brothers had been waiting since midday with their horses and the patience of men who had learned that Callum's timelines were rarely as short as he announced them. Reed was 32 years old and built like something load-bearing. He was not a man who said much, but when he did say something, it tended to land with the quiet certainty of a timber post driven into good ground. He had the hands of a craftsman, large and calloused and precise, and he looked at every structure he encountered with the unconscious professional attention of a man who cannot help evaluating how things are built. He looked at the Apache camp with that attention now. He looked at the framing of the nearest structure, the placement of supports, the way the materials had been chosen for the particular conditions of this place. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. It was Callum had learned over 32 years of being his older brother, the highest praise Reed was likely to offer anything. Owen was 29 and constitutionally incapable of standing still. He had the quick, dark eyes of a man who was always reading the room, or in this case the valley, the particular restless alertness that had made him the best rider and the best scout in their family by the time he was 16 and had never quite become anything other than what it was in the years since. He had noticed by the time Callum reached them that the three men who had blocked the trail were positioned not at random, but at the precise point on the approach that offered the clearest view down into the valley. Those men on the trail this morning, Owen said, without preamble, they were not standing there by accident. No, Callum said, they were standing in the one place on the approach that lets you see the whole camp. Count the horses, count the people, he paused. That is not something you do once. That is something you do regularly. They know that ground about. Callum looked at him, then at Reed. Then he told them everything. The survey of 1879, the land classification, the discovery that the valley was occupied, the refusal to sign, the termination, the 4 years that followed working other men's land in other states while the debt sat in him like a stone in a boot, and the map he had found in his saddlebag the night before his own handwriting looking up at him from the bottom of a bag he had packed himself. Reed was quiet through all of it. He looked at the fire that Callum had built between them, small and practical, the fire of men who build fires because they need them, and not for any other reason. The land here, Reed said finally. Is it good? Better than I expected, Callum said. Much better. Reed nodded once. Then you should agree to the condition, he said, and we should figure out what is under that land before whoever paid those three men figures it out first. Owen was already looking east toward the vantage point where the men had stood. They did not come just to discourage you, he said. They came to look. People do not pay for that kind of looking unless they know something is worth looking at. In the early evening after the camp had eaten and the fires had settled into their evening configurations, Callum was sitting outside his tent when he became aware of a presence nearby. He looked up. Desa was standing a few feet away. She had not made a sound. She stood with her hands at her sides and the white veil moving in the small evening wind, and she looked at him with whatever it was she looked at things with behind that fabric. Callum said nothing. He waited. Do you want to sit? He said. Desa sat not next to him exactly, but near the careful distance of a person who has learned to manage proximity. She arranged the white fabric around herself with the ease of long practice and looked out at the desert in the last of the evening squall. My father told you the land would be yours if you married me, she said. That is true, yes. He did not tell you everything about why. She paused. He told you I wear the veil because it is accustomed to protect me. That is one reason. It is not the only reason. She was quiet for a moment, and when she continued, her voice was level and careful in a way that suggested the words had been thought about beforehand. When I was 15, men began to come to the camp, traders and travelers. They looked at me in a way that I did not understand at first and then understood too well. My father saw it before I did. She stopped. He told them I was ugly. He told them I was cursed. He told them that anyone who came near me would have bad luck for a year. A small pause. The men stopped coming. Callum was quiet. He had not expected this. He thought he was protecting me, she said. In most ways he was, but I have been living inside his protection for 5 years, and protection and a cage are sometimes built from the same materials. The evening star appeared at the edge of the canyon. Callum looked at it and thought about cages built from love and whether that made them less confining or more. The veil was his idea, she said. I keep wearing it because I am not sure yet who I am without it. I have been behind it for so long. She picked up a small stone from the ground near her and turned it in her fingers without looking at it. You asked me this morning what I was reading. No one has asked me that before. Not even my father. Callum thought about that. My father does not know I read in English, she said. Old Joseph gave me the book when I was 12. He said a person who knows the language of the people around them is a person who can never be entirely without power. She paused. My father would not have forbidden it, but I did not want to explain it to him. It was mine. He understood this precisely. The particular value of something that belongs only to you, that exists outside the definitions other people have made for you. The man who came to your father this morning on the trail, Callum said carefully. Ward Pruitt. He felt the quality of her stillness change. What do you know about him, she said. Not enough yet, Callum said. But men who pay other men to turn around generally have something they are protecting. And the something they are protecting is usually a plan that does not work if the wrong person shows up. Dasa was quiet for a moment. He has been coming to the edge of our land for 2 months, she said. He does not come in. He stays outside and watches. Sometimes he sends others in his place. What does your father say about it? My father says he is a small man doing a small thing, and small things are handled by patience. She paused. I think my father does not have as much patience as he used to. Callum nodded slowly. He was putting something together in his mind. Not a complete picture yet. The shape of a frame before the image fills it in. There is something I need to tell you, Callum said. Not tonight, but before the ceremony. He looked at her, at the white veil that moved in the evening air, at the small stone she was turning in her fingers with the absent precision of someone whose hands are always doing something. Something about who I am and how I got here. I will tell you all of it. She was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. It was such a simple response. Not forgiveness, not suspicion, just a person choosing to continue the conversation. And he found in a way he had not expected that it settled something in him that had not been settled for a long time. The desert night came in around them, and they sat together in the quiet for a while, not talking, which was its own kind of conversation. The canyon walls disappeared into the dark. The stars filled in from the horizon upward in numbers that people who have never seen a truly dark sky do not believe until they see them. Disa set the small stone down on the ground beside her with the precision of someone completing a small deliberate act. Then she stood and smoothed the white fabric and walked back toward the camp without looking back. Callum sat where he was and looked at the sky for a long time. Somewhere on the eastern trail, Ward Pruitt was in a camp of his own planning something. Somewhere in the bottom of Callum's saddlebag, a map with his own signature on it was waiting for him to decide what to do about it. And somewhere in this camp, in a tent, he did not know the location of a woman who had been told she was something she was not, was reading, or perhaps not reading, now perhaps sitting with the book in her lap the way she had sat with it earlier, simply having it near her, the way you have something near you that is yours and does not need to be used, only kept. Callum Gray looked at the stars and understood for the first time in 4 years that he had not come to this valley to buy land. He had come here to earn it. Owen found the steak before the camp had finished its breakfast. He had been up since before first light, which was not unusual for him. Owen Gray slept the way some men eat, quickly and without ceremony, taking what was necessary and leaving the rest. He had walked the perimeter of the valley's eastern edge in the gray pre-dawn, not because anyone asked him to, but because it was the kind of thing his body did when his mind was working on a problem, and his mind had been working on a problem since the moment he had identified exactly where Pruitt's men had been standing on the trail the previous morning. The stake was at the base of the eastern canyon wall, driven into the loose soil where the rock met the earth. It was perhaps 18 inches tall with a strip of red cloth tied around the top. The cloth was still bright, not weathered, not faded. This stake had not been here long. He crouched over it and studied it with the focused patience of a man who has learned to read ground the way other men read faces. Then he stood and looked at the angle from the stake to the bend of the river, to the camp, to the far wall of the canyon. He turned slowly the way a compass needle turns, letting his eyes follow the geometry of what he was seeing. He went and got Callum. They rode east along the base of the canyon wall for 40 minutes. Callum found 3 more stakes in that time, each driven at calculated intervals, each marked with the same red cloth. He found them the way he had found thousands of reference points over 4 years of survey work, by looking for the pattern underneath the landscape rather than the landscape itself, by understanding that whoever had placed these markers was thinking in grid lines and triangulation angles rather than in terrain. When he found the fourth stake, he stopped his horse and sat very still. He was doing mathematics in his head that he had done so many times it had become almost unconscious. Distance, elevation, the angle of the riverbed, the composition of the soil in the floodplain, which was darker than it should have been for this elevation and this distance from the water, darker and more moisture retentive, the kind of soil that exists in a specific relationship with what is underneath it. Nolan had ridden out with them. He sat his horse quietly while Callum worked through the calculation, watching him with the careful, non-committal attention of a man who has decided to observe before he judges. "What is this?" Nolan said finally. "It is a surveying stake," Callum said. "You drive them into the ground to establish fixed reference points. When you are measuring and mapping a large area, you triangulate from these stakes to get precise distances and elevations." He looked at the angle from this stake to the one they had found first. "There will be more of them. More. They will form a grid." He looked at Nolan. "Someone has been surveying this valley, not the general territory, this valley specifically." For what purpose? Callum looked at the river bend. He looked at the dark alluvial soil. He looked at the particular configuration of the rock formations on the valley floor, which he had been cataloging without consciously deciding to, since he rode in the day before, the way he cataloged all landscapes automatically and in detail. And then he understood. It came to him not as a sudden revelation, but as the final piece settling into a pattern he had been assembling without knowing it. The way the last word of a sentence you have been reading slowly, suddenly makes the meaning of everything before it clear. "Underground water," he said. Nolan looked at him. "A significant aquifer, possibly one of the largest in the territory." He looked at the river at the camp at the canyon walls. "This is not coincidence, Nolan. The consistent river flow in the dry season, the moisture retention in the soil at this elevation, the particular formations in the valley floor that indicate the underground structure." He paused. "Someone has already done the geological analysis. Someone already knows what is under this ground. Puig is not here because the land is convenient. He is here because someone identified the aquifer and sent him to prepare the legal groundwork." Nolan was quiet for a moment. That had weight to it. "How much is it worth?" he said. Callum looked at the river bend. He thought about the towns coming up along the railroad lines, Tucson, growing faster than its water supply, Phoenix beginning to establish itself, the entire Southern Territory moving toward a scale of human settlement that had not existed here 10 years ago and would not exist in its current form 10 years from now. He thought about what it meant to control the primary water source for that scale of settlement. More than the land, he said. More than the cattle that would graze on the land. More than anything that could be grown here or mined here or harvested here in 100 years of conventional use. He paused. "The company Puig works for Harrove and Sons. They build water infrastructure, pipelines, distribution systems. They need the source to make the infrastructure worth anything. This would make them untouchable." Nolan looked out at the valley with an expression that Callum had seen before on the faces of men confronting the full scale of something they had been partially aware of. It was the expression of a man watching a threat become real. "Then we cannot stop them," Nolan said. "I did not say that." Nolan looked at him. "I said I used to help produce the paperwork that made these things happen," Callum said. "I know exactly how that paperwork works. I know where it holds, and I know where it breaks." He looked at the survey stake at his feet. "The question is whether I can find the break before Puig finds the courthouse." They rode back to camp in silence. Thorne was waiting. Not outside, not at the central fire, but at the entrance to his tent, which meant he had been watching their return from inside and had come to the opening when he saw them coming. He did not say anything when Callum dismounted. He simply held the tent flap open, which was its own kind of statement. Inside the tent, on a flat piece of leather in the center of the floor, were two objects. The first was the copy of the survey map that had been placed in Callum's saddlebag on the trail from Tucson. The second was a leather-bound folder, old and worn at the edges, which Thorne opened and laid flat to show a collection of papers inside. Callum leaned forward slightly and looked at them. They were land records, handwritten records dating back to the 1850s, documenting the presence of the Apache people in this valley. Trade records covering transactions going back to 1866. Correspondence with a territorial official named Silas Holloway, who had spent several years in the early 1860s documenting indigenous land use for the territorial government. Maps drawn by hand in a style that was neither entirely Apache nor entirely the cartographic conventions Callum had been trained in, but something that had emerged from one person trying to communicate with another across a significant gap. I have kept these for 20 years, Thorne said. I knew even then that the time would come when paper would matter more than presence. Callum looked at the documents, carefully turning the pages with the professional attention he had given to thousands of documents over the course of his career. They were not the formal legal instruments that the Bureau would have required, but they were evidence. They were the kind of evidence that a man who knew exactly where the seams were in the relevant legislation could use as the foundation for a much larger argument. He looked up. "How did you get my map into my bag?" he said. Thorne looked at him steadily. "I sent a man to Tucson 14 months ago. His instructions were to find out who had conducted the 1879 survey of this valley and what had happened to that person afterward. Your name was not difficult to find. What happened to you after was also not difficult to find." He paused. "A man who refuses to sign a government authorization and loses his position over it leaves a record. Your man placed the map in your bag on the trail outside Tucson 3 weeks ago. You put it there to tell me you knew who I was. I wanted you to know that I knew. I wanted to see how you carried that knowledge." Callum sat with this for a moment. "How did I carry it?" "You said nothing." Thorne said, "You did not try to explain yourself immediately. You did not try to confess in order to relieve your own discomfort." He paused. "A man who can hold a difficult truth in silence and continue to function is a man who has made his peace with it or is working toward doing so." Callum looked at the survey map. His own signature looked back at him from the lower right corner with the calm indifference of ink on paper. "I came here to fix what I started," he said. "I do not know if it can be fixed, but I know that the land records you have combined with what I know about the 1880 Act give us a foundation to file for formal recognition of occupancy rights. It would take time and it would take someone willing to argue it in front of a territorial judge, but it is possible." He paused. "It is more possible than Pete wants you to know." Thorne was quiet for a long moment. The sounds of the camp came through the tent walls, muffled and distant. The ordinary sounds of people living their ordinary lives in a place that was not at this moment ordinary. "There is something else you need to know," Thorne said. Callum waited. Thorne looked at him with an expression that had set aside everything professional and everything official. The chiefs practiced neutrality, the measured assessment. What remained was the face of a man who was about to say something true and knew it. "Joseph Greyfeather has told me I will not see another winter. He said this 3 months ago. He has been right about such things before. I believe him. The tent was very still. I arranged all of this." Thorne continued, "Because Dasa needs to have something in place before I am gone. Not land, though the land matters. Not a husband in any transactional sense, though that matters too. She needs a person, a specific kind of person." He looked at Callum with an attention that was complete and unhurried. A person who would choose her without seeing her and stayed after seeing her and understand both of those things as part of the same decision. "I understand," Callum said. "You understand the words," Thorne said. "What I am asking you to understand is the weight of them." He folded his hands in his lap. "She has been told by silence and by the veil and by 5 years of being kept apart from ordinary life that she is not something people choose. She has never fully believed this because she is too intelligent to believe something that is contradicted by all evidence. But she has felt it. There is a difference between what the mind knows and what the body has learned to expect." He looked at the leather folder between them. "Today she is going to stand in front of everyone she has ever known and the veil will come off. Whatever happens in that moment will be something she carries for the rest of her life." Callum said nothing. "You are a man with a complicated history," Thorne said. "I know this. What I am asking you to be today is a man who is uncomplicated in one specific moment. That is all. The rest can be complicated. Today, in that moment, be clear." He pushed the leather folder toward Callum across the flat leather between them. "Use what you need," he said. "The thing about a plan that depends on timing is that the timing will never be entirely under your control. Callum picked up the folder. He held it for a moment. "There is something else I need to tell you," he said, "about Puett and about what is under this ground and about what I intend to do." Thorne inclined his head, so Callum told him. He laid it out in the precise sequential way he laid out all technical problems, starting with what he knew and building toward what he could do about it. The aquifer, the Harrove and Sons connection. The continuous occupancy exception in the 1880 Act, which had never been argued in a territorial court, and which, if argued correctly with the right documentation, could not be dismissed without the court engaging with it directly. The need to file in the Tucson Land Office within 30 days before Harrove could file a competing survey claim through federal channels. In the last piece, I need to use my own survey certification, Callum said, the one from 1879. My name is on that document as the certifying authority. If I file an amended certification correcting the occupancy classification from unoccupied to occupied, based on documentation I should have reviewed at the time and failed to, it reopens the original survey determination. It does not guarantee the outcome, but it removes the legal foundation that Harrove is counting on. Thorne looked at him. "What does it cost you?" "I will never work for the Bureau or any government land office again," Callum said. "My certification will be questioned in any future professional context. Men who know the story will have opinions about it." He paused. "I can still work land I own, farm it, manage it, but as a professional authority in land matters, that is finished." Thorne was quiet for a long time. "You are telling me this because you want me to understand what it costs you." "I am telling you this because you have a right to know all the elements of what I am proposing before you agree to it," Callum said. "It is your land, it is your family. You should make this decision with full information." Thorne looked at him for a very long time. Then he said, "My daughter will be reading to your children someday. She will read them that book of hers and others besides it, and they will know things because of her that they would not know otherwise." He picked up the leather folder and handed it to Callum. "Use what you need." Outside, the drums began. That evening, after the camp had eaten and the fires had settled, and the sky had gone the deep particular blue that only exists in the desert for about 20 minutes between the last of the color and the dirt, Callum went looking for Reed and found him where he had half expected to find him. The vat of flat ground on the north side of the camp, where the soil had been cleared and leveled, with obvious deliberate intention, where the remnants of old stakes had been left in the earth when whatever was begun here had been left unfinished. Reed was standing at the edge of it with a length of cord in his hand and an expression on his face that Callum had learned over 32 years to recognize and had learned over the same 32 years not to interrupt without reason. "Reed," Callum said. Reed did not look up immediately. He finished whatever measurement he was making in his head, which was a thing he did with spaces the way some men did with numbers automatically and without needing to write anything down. "Someone started this," Reed said. "Nolan told me Owen said from somewhere behind Callum, stepping out of the shadow he had been standing in, with the ease of a man who spends a great deal of time in shadows and has learned to inhabit them without drama. Started it last year. Not enough people. Not enough time." Reed crouched and pressed his palm flat against the cleared earth. He felt the density of it the way a man feels the composition of something through contact when looking at it is not enough. Then he stood and looked at the space the way he looked at every space he intended to do something with. "Good ground," he said. Callum looked at his brother. There was something underneath the professional assessment, something that Reed was not saying in the way that Reed never said the things that mattered most to him directly. Callum said, using the old form of address from their childhood, "Will you build it?" Reed was quiet for a moment. That was long by most standards and entirely normal for Reed. "I built a house for a woman once," he said, "in New Mexico. Good house. Solid framing. She left because she could not manage the life out here, not because of anything wrong with the house." He looked at the cleared ground. "I have not built for anyone since then." Callum said nothing. "The woman on that rock this morning," Reed said. "She was reading. She was." Callum said. Reed nodded once, the small, decisive nod that meant he had finished a calculation and arrived at a conclusion. "A person who reads the same book 3 times to understand it better each time does not leave when things get hard," he said. "That person stays and understands harder things." He coiled the cord in his hand. "But you need to ask her first, before I measure anything. before I touch one piece of timber. This is her home, not ours. She is the one who decides what gets built on it and where." Callum looked at his youngest brother, who was leaning against the canyon wall, looking out at the dark valley with the expression of a man whose mind was already working three problems ahead of the conversation. "Owen," he said. "Puit is not in Saco Wells," Owen said. "I tracked his sign this afternoon. He is camped on the Eastern Trail, 2 hours ride from here. He has 6 horses." Callum felt the number settle into him. "6," he said. "6," Owen confirmed. "And they are not packed for travel. They are packed for presence." He paused. "He is waiting for something, or he is preparing for something. Either way, he did not go back when you would not go back." "How much time do we have?" Owen looked at the sky the way he always looked at things that told him things completely and from all angles at once. "If he moves at first light and does not hurry," he said, "you have until the ceremony is half finished. Maybe a little longer if the trail runs soft." Callum stood with this. "Then we do not slow down," he said. Reed nodded once. Owen said nothing, but his eyes had already moved on to the next problem, which was the Eastern Trail and the 6 horses and the calculation of what 2 hours ride meant in the morning when a man was motivated. Callum told Dasa that evening. He found her near the eastern edge of the camp, sitting with 2 older women who were working with their hands at something he could not see clearly from a distance. He waited until she had finished and the women had moved on before he approached. He did not sit close. He sat at the careful distance that had become the particular geography of their conversations, close enough to speak without raising his voice far enough away that the space between them remained hers to manage. He told her everything: the survey of 1879, the land classification, the discovery that the valley was occupied, the refusal to sign the termination, the 4 years that followed working other men's land in other states, thinking about what a man was supposed to do with a debt that was not made of money, and the amended certification, what it would cost him professionally, what it would accomplish legally, what he believed it could and could not do. He told it plainly, the way he told things when he was not trying to shape them into something more comfortable than they were. He had made a decision somewhere in the course of the afternoon that her thinking well of him was less important than her thinking accurately about him. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You came back to fix it," she said. "I am trying to. That is different from the men who do not come back at all." She said it simply, without inflation, as a statement of fact rather than a judgment. And there was something in the simplicity of it that landed differently than praise would have landed, more precisely, more like something that had actually seen him, rather than something that was trying to make him feel a particular way. "There is something else," he said. She waited. "I read about Harrove and Sons and the legal structure of their water rights claims before I left Tucson," she said. Callum stopped. She continued, her voice level and precise. "Old Joseph gave me access to the territorial records 2 years ago, when I first understood what Puit's men were doing at the edges of the valley. I could not go into town to research myself, so I wrote letters to the library in Tucson under Old Joseph's name. They sent materials." She paused. "I have been reading about the continuous occupancy provisions of the 1880 Act for 6 months. Callum looked at her, at the white veil that moved in the small evening air, at the careful set of her shoulders. "You prepared," he said. "I always prepare for things other people do not know." "I am preparing for," she said. "That is the advantage of being someone people stop paying attention to." She picked up a small stone from the ground near her feet. "The break you are looking for in the legal framework," she said, "it is in the certification process. If the certifying authority files an amendment citing material factual error in the original classification, the amendment supersedes the original determination pending review. During the review period, which runs a minimum of 6 months under the Act, no competing claim can be processed." Callum was quiet. 6 months, he said. Long enough for the Morrison decision out of New Mexico, which was entered last year, to be formally incorporated into the territorial record as precedent for continuous occupancy claims, she said. After that, the exception is no longer unargued. After that, Harrove cannot dismiss it as theoretical. He looked at her for a long moment. "You knew all of this," he said. "Before I arrived. I knew the framework," she said. "I did not have the certifying authority who could file the amendment." She set the small stone down. "Now I do." The night settled around them. Somewhere behind them, the camp was quieting towards sleep. The fire at the center had burned low and was throwing its last warmth sideways in the small evening wind. Callum looked at the dark canyon walls and thought about what it meant to have underestimated someone. Not in the way you underestimate a threat, but in the way you underestimate a person you have not yet seen clearly. Tomorrow, he said. Yes, she said. Tomorrow. Before first light, Owen came to find him. Callum was already awake. He had not slept much. He had lain on the blanket in the tent and listened to the desert night and thought about the amended certification and the land records and the 6 men camped 2 hours away on the Eastern Trail and the particular quality of stillness in Desa's voice when she described 6 months of reading territorial law in letters addressed in Old Joseph's name. Owen crouched at the entrance to the tent. His face had the specific quality it always had when he had information that mattered. Puit's camp, he said quietly. The horses are not tied the way they were at midnight. Callum sat up. They were tied for camping at midnight, Owen said. Rest knots, long lines. They are tied for moving now. Short lines, ready to pull and ride. He paused. He is not waiting for tomorrow. He is moving this morning. How long have he left? When I checked his camp and rode at a steady pace, Owen said, you have until the ceremony is about half finished, maybe less. Callum thought for a moment. Then the ceremony cannot be delayed, he said. It is not going to be delayed, Owen said. He looked at his older brother. Reed has been measuring since 4 this morning. He knows exactly where every stake goes. And Nolan, he said this carefully, Nolan came and offered to help him before Reed asked. Callum looked at him. I know. Owen said, I was surprised too. Dawn came in around the edges of the tent, canvas pale and thin, and somewhere in the camp the first drum struck once and paused and struck again, and the day that it had been building toward this since before Callum arrived in the valley began in earnest. At the time of reporting, Part 2 is approximately 3,000 words. Combined with Part 1's approximately 7,000 words, the total so far is roughly 10,000 words. Based on the outline, Part 3 needs approximately 10,000 to 12,000 words to bring the full script to the 20,000 to 22,000 word target covering the ceremony. Desa removing the veil, Puit's arrival mid-ceremony, Thorne's public admission, Callum's departure to Tucson, the 3 witness trips signing the amended certification, the final confrontation with Puit Thorne's death in December 1883, and the spring 1884 house staking with the return paper. The morning of the ceremony arrived without fanfare. That was the first thing Callum noticed. He had expected something, some collective shift in the quality of the air, some change in the way the camp moved and breathed the heightened atmosphere that surrounds events people have been anticipating. Instead, the dawn came in the same way it always came in this valley, with conviction and without announcement, the red walls finding their color before anything else did, the river making its sound in the distance, the camp waking in its efficient and unremarkable way. Then gradually the differences became visible. The fires were built higher than usual. The women who had been working near the eastern edge of the camp for the past 2 days were doing something different, are now moving with a purposefulness that had a ceremonial quality to it, each movement too deliberate to be purely practical. Joseph Greyfeather had been outside since before Callum woke, standing near the central fire with his eyes closed and his lips moving in something that was not quite audible and to which no one went near, and around which everyone gave a particular kind of space, the space that exists by unspoken agreement when something important is happening that belongs to someone else. Thorne was not yet visible. Callum washed his face with water from the bucket outside his tent and looked at himself in the small mirror he carried for shaving. The face that looked back at him was familiar in its particulars and strange in its aggregate, the way your own face becomes strange when you look at it too long or in unfamiliar light. He was 34 years old. He had spent 4 years working to exhaustion in other people's fields and other people's pastures. And before that, 4 years doing precise and consequential work in government offices. And before that, a childhood in eastern Tennessee that felt as distant now as a story told about someone he used to know. He was going to be married today to a woman whose face he had not seen. He held this fact in his mind and examined it from the various angles he had been examining it from since the moment he had agreed to the condition, and found that it continued to feel less frightening than it probably should and more right than he could logically account for. He had learned over the years to pay attention to that particular discrepancy between logic and feeling, because in his experience, the logic usually caught up eventually. Reed appeared at the entrance to his tent without knocking, because the tent had no door to knock on, and Reed had never been a man who performed formalities when the practical version of the same action was available. "I have been measuring since 4, Reed said. He placed a small piece of pine in Callum's hand, flat and smooth, with words cut carefully into the surface. The cutting was precise. Reed's hands were always precise. "What is worth building is worth protecting." Their father had said that. He had said it when they were children, and none of them had understood yet why he said it so often, and he had gone on saying it until there was no longer any question about whether they understood. Callum held the piece of pine for a moment. "Thank you," he said. Reed nodded once, the nod of a man who receives gratitude by acknowledging it briefly and moving past it. Then he said, "You need to ask her about the house before I stake anything, before I put one post in the ground. This is her home. She decides what gets built on it." "I know," Callum said. Owen appeared behind Reed with the particular quality of emergence that Owen had always had, arriving in places without appearing to have traveled to them. His expression carried information. "Puit left his camp," Owen said. "I checked the sign at first light. He moved before dawn. At the pace he was making when I last had eyes on him, he reaches the valley in approximately 2 hours." He paused. "Possibly less." Callum looked at Owen, then at Reed. "Then nothing changes," Callum said. "We proceed." Reed nodded. Owen said nothing, which was its own form of agreement. The first drum struck once, paused, struck again. Then a second drum found the rhythm of the first, and a third found the rhythm of both, and the pattern expanded into something that was less like music in the formal sense, and more like the sound of a place expressing something it had been holding. The camp gathered. It happened without announcement. People simply moved toward the central area where the main fire had been built, and the ground had been cleared, and they formed a space in the center of themselves through which a ceremony could move. Callum stood at the center of that space. Reed stood one step behind him and to his left. Owen stood one step behind him and to his right. Neither of them had been placed there by anyone. They had simply arrived in those positions the way people arrive in the positions they are supposed to occupy when they understand what is happening. Thorn emerged from his tent. The camp saw him, and the camp understood what it saw. He was wearing clothing that was different from the practical garments of the preceding days, older, and made with more care, clothing that carried the weight of significance without needing to announce it. His silver hair was arranged with deliberate attention. He walked slowly and with the particular economy of a man who has learned to spend his physical resources carefully, but he walked steadily, and when he reached the center of the cleared space, he stood straight, and the straightness was real, not performed. He looked at Callum. He looked toward the eastern edge of the camp, where the path between the tents was still empty. Then he looked at Callum again, and in his expression was the thing Callum had not seen on his face before. Not the chief's assessment, not the father's calculation, but something beneath both of those. The face of a man who has done everything he could think of to do and has arrived at the moment of having to let go, and is finding in that moment that letting go is both harder and simpler than he anticipated. The sound came from the eastern path. Footsteps, not hurried, not tentative, simply present, the footsteps of a person who is moving toward something deliberately. Desa walked into the cleared space. The white veil caught the morning light the way it had caught every light Callum had seen it in, with a completeness that was not concealment, but a different kind of visibility, presence made visible in a particular way. She moved with the careful grace of someone who is paying attention to every step, not because she is uncertain, but because she understands that what she is walking toward deserves to be approached with full attention. Two older women walked alongside her, one on each side, not touching her, simply accompanying her, their presence a form of witness rather than support. Desa stopped in front of Callum. The drums held their rhythm. Joseph Greyfeather's voice rose and fell in the Apache language, the words shaping themselves into something that occupied the space between speaking and singing and belonged entirely to neither. Thorn moved to stand between Callum and his daughter. He looked at both of them. At Callum, he said the things that needed to be said, the questions that needed to be asked, and Callum answered them honestly, which was the only way he knew how to answer things that mattered. Then Thorn turned to Desa. He placed both hands on her shoulders. He looked at her for a long moment with the complete attention of a man who is memorizing something he knows he will not always be able to see. Then he spoke to her in Apache quietly, and the words were between them and no one else, 30 seconds of something that made her go very still when he finished. He stepped back. He did not lift the veil. He stepped back and he looked at his daughter and he waited. Desa raised both hands. She found the edge of the fabric at her temples. She lifted it up and drew it back over her head in a single continuous motion and let it fall to her shoulders. The sound that moved through the gathered camp was not a gasp. It was something quieter than that, a collective intake of breath that resolved not into surprise or reaction, but into a kind of recognition, the sound of something that had been formless, finding its shape. Callum looked at Desa. She had high, clean cheekbones and a face that was composed and still the posture of someone who is bracing for impact and is determined not to let the bracing show. Her hair was dark and fell in a single heavy fall over her left shoulder. Her jaw was set with the quiet defiance that he had been hearing in her voice for 3 days without having a face to attach it to. And her eyes. Her left eye was brown, a warm and genuine brown, the color of good soil after rain, the color of something real and reliable. Her right eye was green, a clear and steady green, the color of the river seen from above, on a bright day, transparent and deep at the same time. 2 different colors, each complete in itself, both of them looking at him with the direct and precise attention that he had come to understand was simply the way she looked at things, the full weight of her perception applied without modulation. He had known about the eyes, Thorne had told him. But knowing a thing and seeing it were different, as Desa herself had said, and what he had not known was the specific quality of them, the way they looked at something together with a combined attention that was neither the brown nor the green separately, but both at once, 2 different ways of seeing operating as one. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You were reading on that rock on the first morning. You held the book at this angle." He demonstrated with his hands the particular tilt he had observed from 30 yards away in the early light, because the sun was coming from the east and you had positioned yourself so that the light fell on the left page before it reached the right. He paused. "I noticed that." Desa blinked. "I am going to keep noticing things," he said, "for a long time. I want you to know that." A tear moved down her right cheek, then another. She did not move to wipe them, and she did not look away. "Those eyes," Callum said quietly for her alone, "are the most precise and particular thing I have ever seen. They suit you exactly." She made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else, a small released sound of something that had been held for a long time and was finding its way out. It was into this moment that the sound of horses came. Ward Pweet rode into the edge of the camp with 6 men behind him. They did not draw weapons. They did not shout. They arrived with the particular kind of authority that does not need performance. The authority of men who believe the situation is already settled in their favor and are simply appearing to formalize that settlement. Pweet looked at the gathered camp. He looked at Desa standing unveiled in the center of it. He looked at Callum. "I am here to remind everyone present." Pweet said, his voice carrying the practiced projection of a man accustomed to speaking in open spaces, that Harrove and Sons has filed notice of intent with the Territorial Land Office for survey rights to the subsurface water resources of this valley. He paused. "Any legal arrangements entered into today regarding this land will be subject to that prior claim." The camp was very quiet. Owen had moved at some point in the previous several seconds without anyone seeing him do it. He was now positioned behind Pweet's riders slightly to the left, in a location that had not been available when Pweet arrived. Callum had not seen him move. No one appeared to have seen him move. He was simply there now in a place that changed the geometry of the situation. Reed stood where he had been standing, solid and unremarkable, which in Reed's case was its own kind of statement. Pweet's eyes moved over the assembled people and arrived after a moment at Desa. "Miss Thorne," he said, with the tone of a man making an overture he considers generous, "Harrove and Sons is prepared to offer a settlement arrangement that would allow the continued residence of the current occupants in exchange for surface rights. You would retain use of the land. They would retain access to the water resources beneath it." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "This is an equitable resolution for everyone involved." Desa looked at him. She took one step forward. "Mr. Pweet," she said. Her voice was low and clear with its particular quality of precision, each word placed where she intended it. You came here today to make me afraid in the middle of the most significant moment of my life. She paused. You calculated that a woman in a veil at her own wedding would be manageable. You calculated incorrectly. Puig's expression shifted slightly. I have been reading the Territorial Land Code for 6 months, Desa said. Specifically the provisions of the General Land Act of 1880 and its associated amendments. Specifically the continuous occupancy exception in Section 12. Specifically the certification amendment process that allows an original certifying surveyor to correct a material factual error in a previous determination. She looked at Puig with both of her eyes, the brown and the green with the combined precision of both. Harov and Sons filed notice of intent for survey rights based on a prior determination that this land was unoccupied federal territory. That determination is about to be formally corrected by the man who made it. She paused. When that correction is filed, Harov's notice of intent has no legal foundation to stand on. The review period runs 6 months. By the end of 6 months, the precedent from last year's Morrison decision in New Mexico will be formally incorporated into the territorial record. She looked at him steadily. You came here today because you knew this was the window. The ceremony happening now is the window closing. The camp was very still. Owen, from his position behind the riders, said pleasantly, 6 men is a lot of horses for a conversation about water rights. Puig looked at Callum. Something had changed in his expression. The surface confidence was still there, practiced and durable, but underneath it, something had shifted, the specific quality that appears on a man's face when he has miscalculated the number of variables he was dealing with. This is not finished, Puig said. Not yet, Callum agreed. But the next part of it happens in a courthouse, not here. He met Puig's eyes. And in a courthouse, the paperwork is on our side. Puig looked at the camp. He looked at the 6 men behind him, 3 of whom were now looking at Owen and had lost some of the easy confidence they had arrived with. He looked at Desa, who was looking back at him with both of her different colored eyes and the expression of a person who has studied something thoroughly and is not surprised by what she is seeing. He turned his horse. He did not say anything else. He rode out of the camp at a steady pace, his 6 men following, and the sound of their horses moved through the canyon and then faded. And then there was only the sound of the drums and the mourning and the gathered people of this valley. Thorne turned to face his community. He stood straight with an effort that the camp could see, an effort that he did not attempt to hide, and the seeing of it and the not hiding of it were themselves a kind of statement. I told you my daughter was ugly, he said. He said it in both languages, Apache first and then English, so that everyone present and the man who was now part of this community would understand. I told you this to protect her. I told it so many times that I sometimes forgot it was not true. He looked at the camp and at the years of it all, the mornings and the evenings of those 5 years of telling. I was wrong to do it, not wrong to want to protect her, wrong to use that particular tool. He looked at Desa. She is not ugly. She has never been ugly. She has eyes that see more clearly than most and a mind that does not rest when the rest of us do, and a patience I did not teach her because she came with it. He paused. I want her to know that I know this, that I have always known it, and I want her to know it here in front of everyone who heard the other thing, because that is where it needed to be said. Desa walked to her father. She put her arms around him, and he held her completely, and without reserve, the way a man holds something he is aware he will not hold forever. His eyes closed. His hands were steady on her back. And when she stepped away and looked at him with both of her eyes in the morning light, she said something to him in the Apache language that made his jaw tighten and then release, and whatever it was that passed between them in that moment belonged to the 2 of them and to no one else. Joseph Greyfeather spoke the final words. One of the elder women tied the red cord braided fiber, the color of the canyon walls, loosely around Callum's wrist, and then Desa's a binding that was meant to be felt rather than held present, rather than constraining. And then it was done, and the ceremony became something else, and Callum Gray stood in the middle of a community that was no longer entirely separate from him, with the red cord on his wrist and the weight of what had just happened settling into him like something finding its proper level. He left that afternoon. Desa stood with him while he saddled his horse. She did not ask him not to go. She knew what the 30-day window meant as well as he did, possibly better, given 6 months of reading the relevant provisions. She watched him check the saddlebag, the leather folder with Thorne's documents secure inside, and said nothing until he had finished. "You do not need to win this completely," she said. "You only need to close enough doors before they find another one." He looked at her. "I will be back before winter," he said. She looked at him with both of her eyes in the afternoon light, the brown and the green reading him, with the full combined weight of both. "I know," she said. He rode out of the valley with the red canyon walls rising on either side, and the sound of the camp fading behind him, and the weight in his chest was not the weight of the debt he had been carrying for 4 years. That weight had changed. It had not disappeared. But it had changed into something different, something that felt less like a stone in a boot and more like a foundation being laid. The 3 weeks in Tucson had the particular quality of time that moves quickly when measured in tasks accomplished and slowly when measured against where you want to be. Callum went to the land office on his first day. He laid Thorne's leather folder on the desk of the clerk named Ferris, a young man with the permanently harassed expression of someone who has more work than hours and has made a philosophical accommodation with that imbalance. "I need to file an amended survey certification under Section 12 of the General Land Act," Callum said. "I am the original certifying surveyor for the 1879 Red Canyon Valley determination. Here is the documentation supporting the amendment." Ferris looked at the folder. He looked at Callum. He looked at the folder again. "This is going to take some time," Ferris said. "I know," Callum said. "I will wait." He found Everett Bowman on the second day. Bowman was a trader who had been conducting business with the Apache camp in Red Canyon Valley since 1866 and had the records to prove it. 17 years of transaction ledgers in a handwriting so consistent it looked typeset, every trade recorded by date and party and quantity. Bowman was not a man who needed to be persuaded of anything. He looked at Callum, listened to what was needed, and said, "Tell me where to sign and when." Mrs. Adeline Cordell, who ran the post office in Seco Wells, received Callum with the measured assessment of a woman who has spent decades reading people through the letters they send and had developed opinions about most of them. She had been receiving and forwarding correspondence to and from the Red Canyon Valley since 1864. She had the records. She was willing to testify to them. Finding Silas Holloway took 5 days. The former territorial official lived 20 miles outside Tucson on a small dryland farm that produced enough to keep him and not enough to require him to interact with anyone he did not choose to interact with, which appeared to suit him. He received Callum at his door with the guarded patience of a man who has seen enough of official business to distrust anyone connected to it. Callum laid the leather folder open on Holloway's kitchen table. He did not say anything for a moment. He let Holloway look. The old man sat down slowly. He was looking at his own letters from 1862, his own handwriting in the careful, formal style of a government official composing documents for the record, looking back at him from across 21 years. "I filed those reports," Holloway said finally. "Nobody acted on them. I told myself there was nothing more I could do." He was quiet for a moment. "There was something more I could do," he said. "I just did not do it." He looked at Callum. "Show me where to sign." The second visit to the land office produced the 3 witnesses and their sworn statements, each one a different thread in the same argument. 17 years of trade records and 19 years of postal correspondence, and the written account of a government official who had documented what was there and watched it be ignored. Ferris received all of it with the careful attention of a man who understands that what he is processing matters, even if he cannot yet see exactly how. The third visit was for the signature. Callum sat at the desk Ferris had cleared for him and looked at the amended certification he had drafted in the bureau, style he still knew by muscle memory, the formal language of a government instrument correcting a previous determination, the occupancy classification of the Red Canyon Valley Survey, amended from unoccupied federal territory to occupied land with continuous documented habitation dating from 1851. He looked at the signature line. His name would go there, his certification number. The date, "An Hio Dune San Hungden An Yuden Outcome." Ferris said carefully in the tone of a man fulfilling a professional obligation to make sure a person understands what they are about to do. Callum picked up the pen. "File it," he said. He signed his name. Callum Gray, Bureau of Land Management, and underneath it the date April 25th, 1883. He set the pen down. He sat for a moment in the quiet of the land office with the smell of paper and old ink and the accumulated weight of decisions made in rooms like this one, about land that the decision makers had often never stood on. Then he stood and picked up his hat and walked outside. Puit was on the steps. He had the look of a man who has received a great deal of information he did not want to receive and is in the process of deciding what to do about it. He was not particularly surprised to see Callum. He was not performing anything. He simply stood on the steps in the afternoon heat and looked at the man who had just signed away his professional future in order to close a legal door. "You signed it," Puit said. Callum said yes. They have 6 months to contest the amendment. They will use them. They have that right. Callum looked at him. The cost of contesting has increased significantly. The probability of success has decreased significantly. Harov makes decisions based on calculations. This calculation no longer favors the contest. Puit looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has underestimated something and knows it and is deciding how to exist in the knowledge of that. "She knew the law," Puit said. "Your wife. She knew the framework before you arrived." 6 months of reading, Callum said. Puit was quiet for a moment. "I have been doing this work for 15 years, he said. I have not met many people who read territorial land code for 6 months in preparation for something that had not happened yet." Callum said, "She reads everything she thinks she will need. She has been doing that since she was 12. Puit put his hat on. He looked at the land office door, then at the street, then at Callum. In the look, there was something that was not quite concession and not quite respect, but was adjacent to both of them, the expression of a professional encountering something that exceeded his model of what was possible. "Tell your people," Puit said, "that the contest will be filed and then withdrawn. Harov will want a record of the attempt." He paused. "They will not pursue it past the withdrawal." Callum said nothing. Puit walked down the steps and into the street and did not look back. Callum stood on the steps of the land office in the afternoon heat of Tucson and felt something in his chest complete itself. It was not triumph. It was quieter than that. It was more like the sensation of setting down something heavy that you have been carrying for so long that you have forgotten what your body felt like before the weight. He rode back to the valley the next morning. Owen was at the southern edge of the camp when he arrived, doing something with a length of rope that had nothing obviously to do with anything in particular, which meant he had been waiting and had given himself something to do while waiting. He looked at Callum when he rode in and said, "Done," Callum said. "Harov will file a contest for the record. They will withdraw it before the review period ends." Owen nodded. He coiled the rope. "Reed wants you to look at the staking before he goes any further," Owen said. "He has questions about orientation that he says only Desa can answer, but he will not ask her until you have seen the plan." Nolan was at the central fire when Callum dismounted. He had the expression of a man who has been waiting to say something and is choosing the right moment for it. "My uncle is asking for you," Nolan said. Callum went. Thorne was in his tent, seated as he always was, but with a quality of ease that had not been there before, as though something that had been requiring effort had been set aside. The leather folder was gone from its usual place beside him. The tent felt lighter without it, the way a room feels lighter when it has been cleared of something that was never meant to be permanent. Thorne looked at Callum when he entered, and his expression was entirely new. It had dispensed with everything professional and official. The chief's practiced neutrality, the father's careful calculation. What remained was simply a man looking at another man with the full weight of his attention. "It is done," Callum said. Thorne closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them. "Yes," he said, "I can feel it." He reached beside him and took up something that had been resting against the tent wall, which he held out toward Callum. It was a length of leather cord, older than anything else in the camp, the color worn down to something that was less a specific color than the accumulated mark of long use. "This belonged to my father," Thorne said. "He gave it to the man my sister married when she married. It is given when a person becomes family. Not by ceremony, which is a beginning, but by choice, which is the more difficult and more meaningful of the two." Callum took the cord. It was lighter than it looked. "She is reading to the camp children in the evenings," Thorne said. "She started 3 days after you left. She sits outside with the book and reads aloud in English, and then explains the words in Apache, and the children argue about what is going to happen next." Something moved across his face that was genuine and warm. She has not done that before. She did it because she is no longer hidden, and because she understood suddenly that what she has been keeping for herself can be given away without being lost. Callum held the cord in both hands. Go, Thorne said. She is at the river. The path from the camp to the river was a worn track through the scrub, 30 years of feet having made it smooth, clear, and the late afternoon light came in at a low angle through the canyon opening and made the red walls glow in a way that was almost uncomfortable in its beauty, the kind of beauty that is easy to walk past when you are in a hurry and impossible to miss when you are paying attention. Callum walked slowly. He paid attention. Desa was sitting on a flat rock at the river's edge, her feet bare on the stone, a journal open in her lap. Not Monte Cristo, a journal the blank kind in which she appeared to have been drawing. She was not wearing the veil. Her hair was loose. Both of her eyes were open to the afternoon and the river and the light on the water. She heard him. She turned, and the brown eye and the green eye found him, and she looked at him with both of them together and said nothing for a moment. He walked down to the rock and sat beside her, close. The careful distance of the first conversations had retired quietly at some point without either of them formally acknowledging its retirement. The river moved past them with the consistency that had been telling him since he arrived before he understood what he was reading, that it was fed by something deeper and more permanent than surface runoff. The water was clear over the smooth stones of the riverbed, and the late sun caught it and turned it to light. How long have you been coming here? He said. Since I could walk, she said. My mother used to bring me. She said the river knows something the land does not know because it is always moving and always the same at once. He sat with that for a moment. Do you understand it now? He said. She looked at the water. I think it means you can be entirely yourself and entirely changed at the same time, she said. That those things are not opposites. The river moved. A bird somewhere above them made a single purposeful sound and then was quiet. It is done, he said. The amendment is filed. Harrow will contest and then withdraw. She nodded once. She had known it was coming. She had known the framework well enough to know that filing the amendment was not the end of the process, but the end of the window in which the process could be stopped. My father will not see another winter, she said. It was not a question. No, Callum said. I do not think so. She was quiet for a moment. He arranged all of this, she said. Found you, set the conditions, placed the map in your bag. All of it. Yes, he could have told me he was ill. He could have told me the land was in danger. Yes, she looked at the river. He did not, she said, because he knew I would have spent whatever time was left trying to save him instead of building something of my own. Yes, Callum said. She was quiet for a long moment. He is a complicated man, she said. Callum looked at the river. He thought about the leather folder and the 20 years of keeping it and the 14 months of methodical searching through government records to find the right name. He thought about the map placed in a saddlebag on a trail outside Tucson by a man who was already running out of time and had decided to use what remained of it, building the specific thing his daughter would need after he was gone. Yes, Callum said, like most good fathers. She looked at him quickly because those were not the words she had expected, and something in her expression shifted into a warmth that was specific and directed. She opened the journal in her lap and turned it toward him. The pages were full of drawings. Floor plans rendered with precision measurements noted in her neat handwriting along the edges. Elevation sketches, a garden plan with the river orientation marked. Callum looked at the drawings and understood immediately that these were not the rough sketches of someone imagining something vaguely. These were the considered plans of someone who had been thinking about this specifically and in detail for a long time. When did you do these? He said. The first one I drew 3 years ago, she said. I have added to them and changed things since then. She turned a page. This is the most recent version. Callum looked at it carefully with the professional attention he applied to plans and layouts, reading it the way he read land. It was orderly and practical and thoughtful, the plan of a person who understood how a life was actually conducted, rather than how it appeared in someone else's imagination of a life. The East Room, he said, pointing. You have it smaller than the others. Reading does not require a large room, she said. It requires good light and quiet. If you move this wall, he indicated the line 3 feet toward the north, you would lose nothing structural, and you would have space for more shelves along the east face. The morning light from the east window would reach them fully for the first 4 hours of the day. She looked at where he was pointing. She studied it with the focused attention she brought to everything, the full weight of both eyes applied to the problem. Then she picked up the pencil from the fold of the journal and made a note in the margin. Reed wants to stake the foundation tomorrow, Callum said. He has questions about orientation that he says only you can answer. She looked up. East facing, she said. The most important room has to face east. I want the first light. I know, Callum said. I told him. And the cottonwoods, she said. There is a stand of old cottonwoods on the western edge of the shelf above the river. I want the house positioned so they provide afternoon shade but do not block the morning. Callum looked at where the trees stood in the late afternoon light, old and well-established, their roots going deep. He looked at the flat shelf of ground above the river, elevated enough to stay above the flood line, dark alluvial soil. It is the right place, he said. She looked at him with both of her eyes, the brown and the green, each catching the light differently, both of them together doing something that neither could do alone. There is one more thing, she said. She reached into the fold of the journal and produced a small piece of paper worn soft at the creases from years of being opened and closed. She held it out toward him. He took it. He unfolded it. Wait and hope. He had seen this before, held it before, given it back. She had given it to him again now, and the meaning of the repetition was not obscure. He understood it precisely the way he was beginning to understand her, not from explanation but from attention. He folded it once along its original crease and placed it in the breast pocket of his shirt over his heart, where he intended it to stay. I will keep it there, he said. I know, she said. You are a man who keeps things in the right places. The winter of 1883 came early to Red Canyon Valley. Thorne died in December on a quiet evening when the air had the particular cold clarity of desert winter, and the stars were very bright and very close. Joseph Greyfeather was with him. Dasa was with him. He went in the account that Joseph gave later the way a man goes when he has finished what he set out to finish and has given himself permission to rest. They buried him on the hillside above the camp in a place from which the valley was visible to the east, and the river was visible to the west, and the sky was visible in all directions. Disa stood at the grave after everyone else had gone back down, and Callum stood beside her, and for a long time neither of them spoke. He arranged all of this, she said finally, and he did not get to see if it worked. He knew it would work, Callum said. How he had been watching you your whole life, Callum said. He knew what you were. He trusted that. She was quiet. I am still angry that he did not tell me, she said. I know, I understand why he did not. That does not mean I am not angry. I know that too, Callum said. She looked at the grave. He gave me 5 years behind a veil because he was afraid of what would happen to me if people could see me clearly. She paused. And then he spent 14 months finding the one person in the territory who would see me correctly. She exhaled slowly. He was a complicated man, he was, Callum said. She looked at him. You said that before, like most good fathers. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the grave in the valley below it, and the river catching the last light of the afternoon. Thank you, she said, for understanding that those two things can be true at the same time. He said nothing. He stood beside her until she was ready to go down, and then they went down together. The spring of 1884 came late, the way springs sometimes do in the high desert, as though the season has to gather itself before it can commit. When it came, the cottonwoods above the river shelf came back first, their new leaves catching the morning light and holding it in the particular way of new growth, bright and temporary and entirely present. The foundation staking happened on a Tuesday morning in early April. Reed had been ready since February. He had spent the winter months in what Callum recognized as Reed's form of sustained attention, which looked from the outside like nothing much, and was from the inside the precise and patient accumulation of everything needed to do something correctly. He had sourced timber, he had made calculations, he had walked the site at different times of day in different seasons, and understood what the light did and where the wind came from, and how the ground drained when the spring runoff came down from the higher elevations. Nolan had worked with him through most of it, first tentatively, and then with the ease of two men who have found a common language. They did not talk much. They did not need to. Callum stood with Dasa at the edge of the marked perimeter as Reed and Owen and Nolan and four other men from the community drove the first stakes into the ground. The perimeter was laid out exactly as Dasa had drawn it in the journal, with the adjustment to the east room that added the 3 feet she had approved when Callum pointed to the wall. The east room was going to be large enough for books. Dasa stood with the journal open to the floor plan page, her pencil in hand. When something did not align with what she had drawn, she said so precisely and without apology, and the men adjusted without comment because the adjustment was correct and they could see that it was correct. Reed had stopped asking permission for things 3 weeks ago. He had started simply doing them correctly, which amounted to the same thing. At the end of the first day, the perimeter was established. Stakes and string and chalk lines marked the shape of what would become a house, which was not yet a house, but was the shape of one which Callum had learned long ago was the first and most important thing a house needed to be. He stood at the eastern edge of the perimeter as the sun went down and looked at the shape of the east room, larger than Dasa's original plan and perfectly oriented to catch the first light of every morning that was going to happen in this place. Dasa came and stood beside him. "Right," she said, looking at the outline. "Yes," he said. She looked at the cottonwoods, catching the last light. She looked at the river below the shelf, moving with the particular consistency she had been watching her whole life. She looked at the shape of the house that did not yet exist in wood. "My mother used to say," she said, "that a person finds their home twice, once in a place and once in a person." She said they are not always the same discovery. When did she say that? "When I was 10, I did not understand it then." She looked at him. "I understand it now." He looked at the river. "We should start on the framing next week," he said, "before the heat of summer is fully on. The ground is still workable." "I know where it should go," she said. "I have been thinking about it. Show me." She looked at him, both of her eyes in the evening light, the brown and the green, each different, both hers, both part of the same precise and particular way of seeing that had been reading the world carefully from behind a veil and was now reading it in the open. "Come on, then," she said. She walked along the edge of the perimeter toward the eastern corner, toward the room that would catch the morning light, and he walked beside her, and the cottonwoods moved in the small evening wind above them, and the river made its sound below. And the shape of what they were building was marked out in the ground around them in stakes and string, waiting the way all things worth building wait for the work that makes them real. Part 3 is approximately 4,800 words. Combined with Part 1 at approximately 7,000 words and Part 2 at approximately 3,000 words, the total script runs to approximately 14,800 words.